The great river priestess trembles before a mere man. Where is your power now?
The river is waking. You should humble yourself.
The river had been there longer than memory could hold. It curved around the village like a quiet guardian, wide and dark, its surface calm but never still. At dawn, mist rose from its skin like slow breath. At night, moonlight broke upon it in silver lines as if the water itself were watching. The people believed the river saw everything. It watched children learn to walk along its banks. It watched elders bow their heads in thanks. It watched secrets sink and prayers float. Without the river, the village would not exist. Its waters fed the fields where yams and millet grew strong. Its fish filled cooking pots during lean seasons. During droughts, when the land cracked and the air burned, the river still flowed, steady and patient. People said it was not just water. It was memory. It was spirit. It was life given form. Each year, the village gathered to honor it. Before planting season, offerings were placed at the river's edge. Woven mats, carved gourds, fresh grain, and the first fruits of the harvest. No one entered the water on sacred days. No one shouted near its banks. Children were taught early that laughter was welcome, but mockery was not. Respect was not fear. Respect was survival. At the center of these traditions stood the river priestess. She lived alone in a small clay house near the bend where the river deepened and slowed. Her hair was always tied back, her clothes simple and clean. Her eyes carried a stillness that unsettled some and comforted others. She had been chosen young, not by desire but by calling. The elders said the river had marked her before she understood what that meant. Her life was not loud. While others married, raised families, and filled their homes with noise, she listened. She listened to the water at dawn. She listened to it during storms. She listened when the river pulled at its banks as if restless. The duty was heavy and it was lonely. There were days she longed to walk freely among people without being watched, without being weighed by expectation. But she never stepped away. The river did not release those it chose. In the quiet hours, she remembered stories passed down by the priestesses before her. Stories of years when the river swelled in anger. Of seasons when fish vanished and crops failed. Of one man long ago who laughed as he polluted the water, calling it powerless. By the next moon, his name was no longer spoken. Not because people feared it, but because they could not remember it. The elders said the river had taken more than his body. It had taken his place in the world. These stories were not shared to frighten. They were shared to remind. Yet time has a way of softening caution. New generations grew up with full harvests and steady rains. For them, the river became ordinary. Its patience was mistaken for weakness. Respect slowly turned into habit, and habit into neglect. The priestess felt the shift before anyone else named it. The river's song had changed. Not loud. Not violent. Just different. Its current tugged harder at her ankles during morning rites. The birds that once crowded the reeds were fewer. At night, her dreams filled with moving water and faces without names. She tried to tell herself it was nothing. The river had always tested its guardians. But deep inside a tightness grew. A sense that something was approaching, carried gently, the way danger often arrives. Beyond the bend, in the heart of the village, voices were changing too. Laughter had sharpened. Words carried less care. Questions once whispered were now spoken openly. Why fear water? Why bow to what could not speak back? The priestess stood at the river's edge one evening, watching the sun bleed into the current. She placed her palm on the surface. The water was cold, but it did not pull away. It never did. In that moment, she understood that reverence and arrogance were beginning to collide. Faith and mockery were drawing close, like two storms moving toward the same sky. The river flowed on, silent and waiting as it always had. The man who feared nothing walked through the village as if the ground owed him space. His steps were easy, confident, and loud enough to be noticed. He smiled often, but it was not a warm smile. It was sharp, quick, and daring, the kind that challenged others to question him. His voice carried far, and when he spoke, people listened. Not because he was wise, but because he was fearless in a way that felt contagious. His name was known in every corner of the village. Mothers shook their heads when their sons followed him. Elders frowned but rarely stopped him. The younger ones admired him most. He spoke the words they were afraid to say. He laughed at things they had been taught to respect. And he did so without shame. He did not believe in spirits. He did not believe in sacred water. To him, the river was just a river. It flowed because land sloped downward, not because it had a will. When others bowed their heads before it, he stood tall. When offerings were laid at its edge, he walked past without slowing. Once he had believed differently. Years ago, before his voice hardened and his laughter grew loud, He had knelt beside his mother at the riverbank. She had prayed softly, thanking the water for carrying her worries away. She had trusted it. When sickness came, she believed the river would protect her. When death followed instead, something inside him broke. He never spoke of that day. He never said how long he waited for the river to answer. He only remembered the silence. From that moment, faith felt like a lie told to soften loss. Respect felt like weakness dressed as tradition. As he grew older, his disbelief turned into defiance. If the river had failed his mother, then it deserved no honor. If the gods had watched and done nothing, then they were either cruel or empty. He chose to believe they were empty. His pain did not fade. It buried itself beneath pride. Around the fires at night, he told stories that bent old teachings into jokes. He spoke of how the river could not stop floods or prevent droughts elsewhere. He asked why a true power would care about songs and offerings. The younger villagers laughed, unsure at first, then louder as his confidence made doubt feel brave. Soon boys skipped small rituals. Girls crossed the river on sacred days without fear. A quiet change spread, carried on his words. The elders noticed, but they were tired. They had seen change before and believed the river would correct what needed correcting. The man did not fear correction. One morning, during a cleansing rite, he walked straight through the water while the priestess stood at a distance. The ripples broke the careful pattern of the ritual. Some gasped. Others turned away. He only smiled and shook the water from his hands as if brushing off dust. See, his silence seemed to say. Nothing happens. That moment lingered in the air long after he left. It was small, almost harmless, but it planted something dangerous. Doubt grows fastest when consequences delay. Inside him, though, the man was not as calm as he appeared. There were nights when sleep refused him. Nights when he dreamed of his mother calling his name, her voice stretched thin by distance. He woke angry, not afraid. Anger was easier to carry. He told himself he was free. Free from fear. Free from old rules. Free from waiting for answers that never came. And yet each time he passed the river, his pace quickened. Each time the priestess's eyes followed him, something tight twisted in his chest. He ignored it. The village began to change its tone. Respect became optional. Jokes grew bolder. Traditions were still practiced, but without care. The river continued to flow, calm and patient, as if it noticed nothing. The man stood at its bank one afternoon, throwing small stones into the water, watching them disappear. He felt powerful in that moment. Untouched. Unchallenged. He did not know that pride, when left unchecked, speaks louder than mockery. And the river, though silent, had begun to listen. The river priestess had learned long ago that silence could be heavy. It pressed against her chest in the early mornings when the village still slept and the river breathed alone. In those hours, memories came without permission. She remembered being a child, pulled gently from play, told her life would no longer belong to her alone. She remembered watching others choose love, families, and freedom, while she chose duty because the river did not ask twice. She had never regretted the calling, but she carried its weight every day. Lately, that weight had grown heavier. The river no longer spoke in calm patterns. Its rhythm was uneven, like a heart struggling to stay steady. When the priestess knelt to wash her hands before dawn prayers, the water pulled back sharply, then surged forward again. It was restless. It was warning her. That morning, as the sun rose pale and weak, the vision came. She saw the river swollen and dark, not with flood, but with absence. Faces leaned over its surface, searching for reflections that did not appear. She heard voices calling a name that dissolved before it could be spoken. The water swallowed the sound, smooth and final. When she reached out, her own reflection trembled, as if unsure it belonged to her. The priestess gasped and fell back onto the damp earth. Her heart pounded. Visions were rare and never gentle. This one clung to her long after the river returned to stillness. She did not need to ask what it meant. Disrespect had reached a breaking point. Someone stood too close to erasing more than tradition. She knew who. By midday, she walked into the village, her steps slower than usual. People noticed the tension in her posture, the way her eyes searched faces instead of the ground. Whispers followed her path. Some lowered their heads. Others watched with guarded curiosity. She found the man surrounded by young villagers near the shade trees. Laughter rose as she approached, then thinned. He turned last, his smile already forming, already prepared. The priestess did not raise her voice. She never did. She spoke calmly, with care, as one would speak to a wounded thing. She warned him that the river was not blind. That patience was not weakness. That mockery, once rooted, grew into loss. She told him the water remembered every step taken without respect. Her words were not sharp. They carried concern, not threat. She did not speak of punishment. She spoke of balance, of the cost of forgetting what gives life. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not fear but irritation. Being warned without being challenged felt like insult. Then he laughed. The sound cut through the quiet like a blade. It was loud, exaggerated, and confident. Heads turned. He repeated parts of her warning in a mocking tone, twisting meaning into humor. He gestured toward the river as if inviting it to respond. The crowd shifted. Some laughed with him, unsure but eager. Others stared at the ground. A few elders stiffened, shame tightening their faces. The priestess stood still. Each laugh struck deeper than anger ever could. She felt exposed, not as a woman but as a symbol. In his mockery, he stripped centuries of belief and placed them on display as foolishness. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the insult feel personal. He questioned her calling, her power, her worth. He suggested the river needed no guardian, only silence from those who clung to old fears. When he finished, the air felt thin. The river behind her lapped once against the bank, louder than it should have. She did not respond with anger. She bowed her head slightly, not to him but to the water. That quiet act unsettled some more than any shout could have. Then she turned and walked away. Behind her, the village stood divided. Laughter lingered in pockets, brittle and forced. Fear crept into others, slow and cold. People began choosing sides without speaking. Belief against disbelief. Humility against pride. As the priestess reached the river bend, her hands trembled. Not from humiliation alone, but from dread. The warning had been given. Compassion had been offered. What followed would no longer be guided by words. She knelt at the edge and pressed her forehead to the earth. The river flowed past her, quiet once more, but its silence felt different now. It was no longer waiting. It was deciding. Far behind her, the man who feared nothing laughed again, unaware that something precious had just been placed at risk. And the river, ancient and patient, held his name close, listening, remembering. The day it happened, the air felt strange from the moment the sun rose. The sky was clear, yet heavy, as if something unseen pressed down on the village. People moved through their routines with quiet unease. Doors closed a little harder. Voices dropped without reason. Even the children, usually quick to shout and run, stayed close to their homes. By midday, word spread that the man would go to the river. Some said he planned to prove, once and for all, that the river held no power. Others followed out of curiosity, unable to resist the pull of a moment that promised excitement. By the time the crowd gathered near the riverbank, it felt less like a gathering and more like a test. The river lay wide and calm, its surface smooth as polished stone. Sunlight rested on it gently, giving no sign of anger. To many it looked harmless, too quiet to be feared. The man stepped forward, confident as ever. His shoulders were loose, his face open, his smile bright with challenge. He greeted the crowd with raised hands as if stepping onto a stage built just for him. Laughter followed, nervous at first, then louder as he fed it with careless gestures. The river priestess stood apart, near the sacred bend. She had not come to confront him. She had come to witness. Her face was still, but her eyes never left the water. She felt the river's tension beneath the calm, like a held breath. The man spoke loudly, mocking the old rules. He pointed at the water and questioned its silence. If the river truly held power, why did it not answer him now? Why did it allow doubt to spread? Then he did what no one had done in generations. He took a sacred carving meant only for offerings and threw it into the river with force. It struck the surface and sank quickly, swallowed without sound. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some stepped back. Others leaned forward, eyes wide. The man laughed. He stepped closer to the edge, dipped his hands into the water, and splashed it toward the people watching. Drops scattered across the bank, soaking the earth meant for prayer. He wiped his wet hands on his clothes, careless and proud. See, his body language boasted. Nothing happens. The crowd reacted in waves. A few young villagers laughed with him, though their voices cracked. Others stood frozen, fear tightening their chests. Elders whispered urgently, their faces pale. No one moved to stop him. The moment had grown too large, too fragile. Then the river shifted. Not violently. Not suddenly. Just enough to be noticed. The current near the bank changed direction, circling once before smoothing out again. The birds nesting in the reeds fell silent all at once, as if a signal had passed through them. The air cooled. Clouds drifted over the sun, dimming the light without warning. The laughter thinned. The man paused just for a heartbeat. His smile stayed, but his eyes flicked toward the water. The pause passed quickly. Pride pushed him forward again. He raised his arms, inviting the river to respond more clearly. Nothing happened. But the silence that followed was heavier than noise. It pressed against ears and skin. Even breathing felt loud. The priestess closed her eyes. She felt the river pulling inward, not outward, drawing something close, marking rather than striking. A child began to cry. A woman covered her mouth. Somewhere in the crowd, a name was spoken twice in confusion, as if it did not sound right. The man stepped back from the water, his confidence slightly shaken, though he refused to show it. He scoffed once more, louder than necessary, and turned away. As he walked past the priestess, he did not look at her. She did not look at him. Behind them, the river returned to its steady flow. The birds slowly resumed their calls. Sunlight crept back through the clouds. To an outsider, it might have seemed like nothing at all had happened. But the village felt it. People dispersed quietly. Conversations were hushed. No one laughed on the walk home. Even those who had supported the man felt a cold unease settle in their bones. That night, the river sounded different. Louder. Deeper. Its movement carried a low murmur that crept into dreams. The priestess remained awake, sitting at the river's edge long after darkness fell. She did not pray for punishment. She prayed for mercy. Far away, the man lay restless, staring at the ceiling of his home. The laughter from earlier echoed faintly in his ears, thinner now, less certain. He told himself nothing had changed. The river had done nothing. Yet, somewhere beyond thought, something had begun. The river had not struck. It had not risen. It had not taken a life. It had taken notice. And as the village slept, unaware of how deeply the moment would reach, the river held its silence close, heavy with what was to come. The changes did not arrive with thunder or broken banks. They came quietly, slipping into daily life the way rot settles into wood, unseen until the damage is done. The first sign was the water itself. At dawn, women who came to fill their pots noticed the river no longer met them where it always had. The edge had pulled back just enough to feel wrong. The water tasted the same, looked the same, yet something about it felt distant, as if it were listening instead of giving. By midday, the current slowed in some places and rushed in others, twisting in strange patterns that ignored the natural bend of the land. Farmers complained that irrigation channels dried too quickly. Fish traps returned empty. Livestock refused to drink, snorting and pulling away as if the river carried a scent only animals could sense. Then came the dreams. People woke before dawn with wet palms and racing hearts. They dreamed of standing before the river and calling out, only to hear nothing echo back. Some dreamed of faces reflected in the water, mouths moving without sound. A few woke certain they had heard their own names whispered, thin and fading, like smoke stretched too far. Fear began to replace laughter. The man noticed the shift but refused to acknowledge it. When others spoke in low voices, he spoke louder. When elders gathered to discuss the changes, he mocked their worry, calling it coincidence dressed in fear. Yet even he felt it. A tightening. A pressure behind the eyes. The river no longer ignored him. It watched. Stranger still was what began to happen with his name. At first it was small. A woman calling across the market stopped mid-sentence, frowning as if she had forgotten a word. A child tugged at his sleeve, hesitated, then walked away confused. Once an elder greeted him warmly, then grew quiet, eyes narrowing as if unsure who stood before him. He laughed it off. People forget names all the time, he told himself. But the moments multiplied. His name slipped from conversations like water through open fingers. Records scratched into wood or inked on cloth appeared smudged, letters blurred as though rubbed by careless hands. When he introduced himself to strangers, the sound felt wrong in his mouth, as if it did not belong to him anymore. At night, he dreamed of standing before the river, shouting his name into the current. Each time, the water carried it away before it could return. The river priestess felt the changes more deeply than anyone. She walked the riverbank each morning, her feet sinking into damp earth that no longer held warmth. The water no longer brushed against her gently. It flowed past her hands with indifference. She knew this feeling from old stories. This was not rage. This was withdrawal. The river was taking something back. Guilt settled heavy on her shoulders. She replayed the warning again and again in her mind. Had she spoken too softly? Had compassion delayed what firmness might have prevented? She knelt longer in prayer, her forehead pressed into the soil until her skin burned. She asked the river if mercy was still possible. The river did not answer. In the village, fear spread quietly but completely. Parents pulled children close. Offerings returned to the riverbank, clumsy and hurried, filled with apology rather than faith. People avoided speaking the man's name aloud, not from respect, but from discomfort. The sound felt wrong, like calling into an empty house. The man began to notice how often eyes slid past him, how conversations ended when he approached, how laughter died the moment he spoke. Pride still pushed him forward, but something inside had started to crack. One evening, he stood at the river's edge alone. The sky burned red as the sun fell. He shouted at the water, demanding it explain itself. His voice echoed once, then vanished. The river continued to move, unchanged by his anger. For the first time, doubt crept in. Not fear of punishment, but fear of erasure. The priestess watched from a distance, hidden by reeds. She saw the way his shoulders sagged when no answer came. She felt no satisfaction, only sorrow. This was the slow part of consequence, the part that did not teach through pain but through loss. The river did not rush. It never had. It wore away stone grain by grain. It erased names the same way. As night fell, the village lights dimmed early. Doors closed. People whispered prayers they had not spoken in years. The river flowed on, steady and quiet, carrying dreams, doubts, and one fading name deeper into itself. By morning, everyone would feel it more clearly. The river was changing. And with it, so was the man who once believed it held no power at all. The man woke one morning with a strange feeling crawling along his skin, as if something had brushed past him in the night and taken warmth with it. The room looked the same. The walls stood where they always had. His hands were still his hands. Yet something was wrong in a way he could not name. He stepped outside and greeted a neighbor who passed by his door. The man nodded politely, paused, then frowned. "Yes?" the neighbor asked, uncertain. The pause lingered too long. The greeting had not landed. The man felt it sink into him like a stone. He forced a laugh and repeated himself, louder this time. The neighbor's eyes searched his face, uncomfortable, then he walked on without replying. The man stood frozen, his smile fading. All that day the same thing happened. People looked at him as if he were familiar but misplaced, like an object remembered from a dream. Some avoided him altogether. Others stared openly, trying to fit him into memory and failing. When he spoke his name, it sounded thin, like a word learned too late. By evening, anger rose in him like fire. He stormed through the market, demanding answers. A woman he had known since childhood listened patiently, then shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said softly, eyes full of confusion. "I know your face. I can't place you." That night, he stood before a polished metal mirror. He studied his reflection closely. His features were sharp, unchanged, yet something about them felt loose, as if they did not fully belong together. He said his name aloud again and again, trying to anchor it to his face. Each time it slipped away faster. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it brought broken dreams. He saw himself walking through the village calling out, while people passed straight through him as if he were smoke. He saw the river stretching wide, its surface smooth and endless, his name floating upon it like a leaf before sinking without a trace. He woke drenched in sweat, gasping. The confidence that once wrapped him like armor began to crack. His laughter stopped coming naturally. His voice lost its edge. Fear, the thing he had mocked all his life, settled deep in his chest. He went to the elders, demanding they explain what was happening. They listened in silence, exchanging worried glances. One of them spoke at last, but carefully, as if afraid the words might vanish. "This is the river's work," the elder said. "It takes what is disrespected." Slowly. The man scoffed out of habit, but the sound fell flat. Even he did not believe it anymore. Desperation drove him to the place he had avoided since the warning. The river priestess's home sat quiet by the bend, smoke rising thinly from its roof. He hesitated before stepping forward. Pride urged him to turn away. Fear pushed harder. She met him at the doorway, her face calm but weary. When he spoke, she did not use his name. Not because she refused to, but because it no longer rested easily on her tongue. He demanded help. Not gently. Not humbly. His words tumbled out sharp and uneven, filled with blame and disbelief. He said something was being taken from him. That it was unfair. That the river had no right. The priestess listened without interruption. She saw the fear behind his anger, the way his hands shook when he clenched them. She felt the river stirring behind her, heavy and present, like a judge listening from the shadows. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. She told him the river did not steal without reason. It returned balance. It remembered what people tried to forget. A name, she said, was more than a sound. It was a place in the world. To mock the source of life was to loosen one's grip on belonging. He turned away, pacing, dragging his hands through his hair. For the first time, words failed him. The truth pressed too close to ignore. Outside, the river surged slightly against the bank, louder than before. The sound filled the space between them. It did not threaten. It watched. The man fell silent. In that silence, something broke. He lowered himself to the ground, breath shallow, eyes wide. He admitted what he had never spoken aloud. That he was afraid of being forgotten. That he had mocked belief because belief had once failed him. That losing his mother had taught him to trust nothing that promised comfort without proof. His voice cracked when he spoke of her. The name stuck in his throat, heavy and painful. The priestess felt her own chest tighten. She had heard many confessions, but this one carried a rawness that cut deep. Still, she did not offer comfort yet. The river hears truth, she said quietly. But hearing does not mean undoing. The river's presence grew stronger, its sound filling the air like slow breathing. The man felt small beneath it, smaller than he had ever felt in his life. His pride had nowhere left to stand. For the first time he bowed his head. Not in worship, not fully, but in surrender. Outside, the village moved on, unaware of the turning happening by the water's edge. Names were still being forgotten. Dreams were still restless. The river continued its work, patient and unyielding. The man remained on the ground long after the priestess stopped speaking. When he finally rose, his steps were slow, uncertain. He was still himself, but only barely. His name, once spoken loudly and often, now hovered at the edge of silence. And the river, ancient and watching, had not yet decided how much it would take before balance was restored. The river was calm the next morning, but its calm no longer felt gentle. It felt deliberate, like a hand held steady before making a choice. Mist lay thick over the water, blurring the line between surface and sky. The river priestess stood at the bend before sunrise, her feet bare on the cold earth, her thoughts heavier than her body. She had not slept. The man's confession echoed in her mind. His anger. His fear. The way his voice had broken when he spoke of his mother. She had heard many stories of loss in her years of service, but his pain carried a sharp edge. It had hardened into mockery, into pride that dared the world to challenge him. She realized then what troubled her most. Part of her had resented him long before he mocked the river openly. Not just because he disrespected tradition, but because his laughter reminded her of everything she had given up. The freedom to doubt. The freedom to walk away. That truth stung. The river stirred, slow and deep, as if responding to her thoughts. She closed her eyes and listened. Not with her ears alone, but with memory. With the lessons passed down by those who came before her. The river did not punish out of anger. It corrected imbalance. It returned weight where lightness had grown careless. Names were not taken to destroy, but to remind people that identity was tied to respect, to community, to life itself. Later that day the man returned. He looked different. Smaller somehow. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes shadowed. When he stood before the priestess, he did not demand this time. He waited. The waiting itself felt like an apology. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said at last. His voice was quiet, stripped of its old sharpness. "When people look at me, I see it in their eyes. I am fading." The priestess studied him closely. She saw the truth written in his fear. His pride had been a shield, but it had also been a wall that kept him from healing. She told him to sit. They faced the river together, side by side, not as enemies, not as allies, but as two people shaped by loss. The water moved steadily before them, reflecting nothing clearly. She spoke then, not as a guardian, but as a woman who had carried duty for too long without speaking its cost. She told him how she had been chosen as a child. How her life had narrowed into service. How she had learned to bury anger beneath ritual and silence. How mockery hurt not because it challenged belief, but because it dismissed sacrifice. He listened without interruption. Each word settled into him like soil over seed. When she finished, the river shifted again. The current deepened, drawing inward. The air grew cool. Both of them felt it. The priestess placed her palm against the water. The river showed them truth. Not in images alone, but in feeling. The man felt his mother's presence, not as a promise broken, but as a life that had been held, however briefly. He understood for the first time that the river had not failed her. It had carried her beyond his reach, the way it carried all things eventually. His anger had not protected him from loss. It had only isolated him from meaning. Tears rose, surprising him. He did not wipe them away. The priestess felt the river's burden too. She felt every name it had taken, every memory it guarded. She realized that in her silence she had sometimes allowed fear to grow unchecked. Balance required more than patience. It required courage. The river does not want your destruction, she said softly. It wants your honesty. It wants you to remember that life is shared, not challenged. He nodded, trembling. Understanding settled in slowly, painfully. Accountability, he learned, was not cruelty. It was recognition. It was being seen fully without the mask of pride. For the first time he did not argue. He did not mock. He did not defy. He asked what could be done. The priestess hesitated. What came next was not written in the safe rituals of the past. The river's pull had reached deeper. Retrieving what was being taken would demand a price. Balance always did. She looked at him, then at the water. She felt fear rise, not for herself alone, but for what she might have to give. The river may return what it is taking, she said slowly, but it will not do so freely. He swallowed hard. I will pay, he said too quickly. She shook her head. You do not yet understand. Payment is not chosen lightly. It changes who you are. The river flowed on, steady and listening. Silence wrapped around them, not empty this time, but full of meaning. The man bowed his head again, deeper than before. This time it was not surrender born of fear. It was humility born of understanding. Whatever came next, he knew one thing clearly. Mockery had been easier than truth. Pride had been easier than grief. But the river did not respond to what was easy. It responded to what was real. And as the sun climbed higher, casting pale light across the water, both the priestess and the man felt the weight of what lay ahead. The river had revealed its nature. Not vengeance. Balance. And balance, once disturbed, always demanded to be restored. The priestess did not speak of the ritual right away. She waited until night fell and the village lights dimmed, until the river reflected only darkness and stars. This was not a rite meant for curious eyes or fearful whispers. What was about to be done stood outside the safe paths passed down through generations. It was forbidden for a reason. She led the man to a narrow clearing near the deepest bend of the river, a place few villagers dared to approach. The air felt thick there, heavy with memory. The water moved slowly, dark and smooth, as if hiding its depth on purpose. The man's steps were careful now. Gone was the stride that once challenged the earth. Each movement carried doubt, but also resolve. He had felt himself thinning, slipping from the world. Whatever the cost, he could not endure becoming nothing. The priestess gathered the items needed for the ritual with steady hands. A bowl carved from old wood, ash from sacred herbs, a strip of cloth worn thin by years of prayer. Each object held meaning, not power by itself, but weight. The river did not answer to tools. It answered to truth. She knelt at the water's edge and motioned for the man to do the same. This ritual is not to force the river, she said quietly. It is to ask. And asking means offering. He nodded. His throat felt tight. The night seemed to press closer, as if listening. She warned him then, clearly and without comfort. The river could return his name, but it would take something in exchange. Balance demanded it. What was mocked must be honored. What was denied must be faced. The cost would not be blood. It would be memory or time or belonging. Something that shaped who he was. Fear flashed across his face. For a moment, the old instinct to argue rose in him. Then he remembered the empty looks, the forgotten greetings, the way his own name no longer felt solid. I choose to be remembered, he said finally, voice shaking. Even if it costs me who I was. The priestess closed her eyes. She felt the river respond, not with sound, but with pressure, like a current tightening around her chest. This choice would mark them both. She began the ritual. She traced symbols into the damp earth, not hurried, not hesitant. She mixed ash with river water, watching it darken and thicken. When she spoke, her words were low and steady, shaped by respect rather than command. The river stirred. Its surface rippled outward in slow circles, though no wind touched it. The night grew colder. Somewhere in the reeds, an unseen creature fled. The man felt a pull deep inside him, as if invisible hands reached into his chest and searched. Images rushed through his mind. His mother's smile, his younger self laughing by the water, the moment his disbelief hardened into mockery. Each memory burned, bright and fragile. The priestess gasped softly. The river's answer came clear and unforgiving. To restore the man's name fully, it would take part of her memory. The years she had spent guarding the river would blur. Faces, moments, and pieces of herself would be lost forever. She would still serve, but never with the same certainty. This was the price. Her breath caught. For the first time in many seasons, fear shook her resolve. Her duty had already cost her a life lived in full. Now it asked for more. The man felt the shift and looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as a symbol. Not as a barrier. As a woman who had carried too much alone. "No," he whispered. "Take it from me." The river surged slightly, firm and final. The priestess understood. Balance was not about fairness. It was about restoration. His mockery had weakened the bond between river and guardian. The cost would mend that bond but leave a scar. She hesitated only once more. Then she nodded. She pressed her palm into the water and released the offering. The current wrapped around her wrist, cold and sharp. Pain flashed through her mind, not of the body but of loss. Names slipped away. Memories dimmed. She cried out, not loudly but deeply, as if something precious had been pulled from her soul. The man screamed as well, his voice breaking as his name surged back into him, heavy and solid. He felt himself anchor again to the world. The ground beneath him felt real. The air filled his lungs fully. The river calmed. Silence fell hard and complete. The priestess collapsed forward, breathing unevenly. The man caught her before she struck the ground. His hands trembled as he held her, guilt crushing his chest. She opened her eyes slowly. Confusion flickered there, then steadied. "It is done," she said softly, though part of her no longer remembered all that had led to this moment. The river flowed on, smooth and quiet as if nothing had happened. But both of them knew better. Something had been restored. Something had been lost. And neither of them would ever be the same again. Morning came slowly, as if the village itself was unsure whether to wake. Pale light slipped through the trees and touched the river's surface. The water looked calmer than it had in days. Not empty. Not tense. Balanced. The ritual had ended, but its weight remained. The river priestess woke near the bank, her body aching as though she had traveled a great distance without moving. For a moment she did not know where she was. The river sounded familiar, yet distant, like a song remembered from childhood. She sat up slowly, her hand pressing into the earth for support. The man knelt nearby, watching her closely. When she opened her eyes, relief washed over his face so sharply that it hurt. "You stayed," he said quietly, not trusting his voice. She nodded, though the motion felt uncertain. Pieces of her memory floated just beyond reach. She knew who she was. She knew her duty. But the path that had led her here felt broken, as if parts of her life had been gently erased rather than torn away. The river moved behind them, steady and full. When they returned to the village, people felt the change immediately. Conversations flowed more easily. Children laughed without fear. Elders breathed deeper, their shoulders easing as if a long-held weight had finally been set down. And the man's name returned. It did not arrive loudly. It slipped back into mouths naturally, without effort. People greeted him with recognition, though something in their eyes had changed. They remembered who he was, but they also sensed who he was no longer. He felt it too. The sharp edge that once defined him was gone. His laughter no longer cut through others. It warmed instead, quieter, careful. He spoke less and listened more. The village did not celebrate his return to memory, but it accepted him, cautiously at first, then with growing trust. He did not reclaim his old place. That version of him had been taken, and rightly so. The river priestess resumed her role, but her presence was different now. She still rose before dawn. She still performed the rites. Yet there were moments when she paused, uncertain, needing guidance from elders younger than herself. Sometimes she forgot details of rituals she had once known by heart and had to relearn them slowly. Some whispered that she had weakened. Others understood the truth. She had paid a price so the village would not lose another soul. The river reflected this new balance. Its flow returned to familiar patterns. Fish traps filled again. Crops drank deeply from its channels. Animals no longer shied away from its edge. The unsettling dreams faded, replaced by ordinary sleep and simple worries. But the river was not the same either. It felt closer, more present, as if the boundary between spirit and people had thinned. Respect returned, not out of fear but understanding. Offerings were made with care, not obligation. Silence at the riverbank felt natural again. The man often stood there in the evenings, watching the water move. He no longer challenged it. He spoke to it quietly, not expecting answers. Sometimes he thanked it. Sometimes he apologized. Sometimes he simply stood and listened. He helped the priestess when she allowed it. He carried water. He gathered offerings. He accepted correction without protest. Service became his way of honoring what he had once mocked. The village noticed. Children who once followed his bold defiance now followed his quiet example. Elders nodded when he passed. Trust rebuilt itself slowly, like stone shaped by steady water. One evening, the priestess stood beside him at the bend. The sun dipped low, painting the river gold. She watched the light dance on the surface, feeling both peace and absence inside her. "I don't remember everything," she said almost to herself. He lowered his head. "I know. But I remember why it matters," she continued. "Perhaps that is enough." He looked at her then, truly grateful not just for his name but for the chance to become someone worthy of it. The river flowed on, neither punishing nor rewarding, simply existing as it always had. It had taken pride. It had taken certainty. It had taken memory. In return it had given balance. The village stood whole again, not untouched, but wiser. The scars remained, but they no longer bled. As night settled and stars reflected on the water, the river carried the past gently within it, no longer heavy with warning. What it had taken it would keep. What it had given it would protect. And in that quiet exchange, life continued, shaped not by arrogance or fear, but by understanding earned at a cost no one would ever forget. Time moved slowly after the river had restored balance, as if the village itself was learning to breathe again. Days were ordinary, yet every sunrise felt heavier with meaning. People noticed small things. The way the river reflected the sky more clearly, the way fish returned in abundance, the way the wind carried whispers that reminded them of lessons once forgotten. Life flowed forward, but the memory of what had happened lingered like mist over the water. The man who had once mocked everything now walked quietly among the villagers. His name had returned, yet the person he had been, the proud, fearless, mocking man, was gone. He spoke less, listened more, and carried humility like a garment he had just learned to wear. Children watched him with curiosity, not admiration, and elders offered nods of cautious approval. He lived simply, tending small tasks, helping where needed, and never seeking the spotlight he once craved. In every act, he reminded the village of the fragile weight of identity and the cost of arrogance. The river priestess continued her watch, though her role had changed subtly. She moved with careful intention, no longer taking her calling for granted. Rituals were performed with renewed focus, guided not just by tradition, but by hard-won wisdom. Some mornings she paused, feeling gaps in memory where the river had claimed pieces of her past, yet each loss was a reminder that balance demanded sacrifice. The villagers sensed her endurance, her resilience, and gradually respect deepened, not from fear but from understanding. Stories began to circulate again at firesides and under shade trees. Elders recounted what had occurred, not to frighten children but to teach. The tale of the man who feared nothing and the river priestess who gave everything became a quiet legend, passed from one generation to the next. It was a story of consequences, of humility, and of reverence. Children learned that the river watched, not to punish capriciously but to remember, to hold accountable, and to restore balance. And the villagers, old and young, felt a renewed connection to the water that had always sustained them. Occasionally the man walked to the river alone. He did not speak, did not gesture, did not mock. He stood on the bank, feeling the flow against his feet, listening to the water as it carried the echoes of past deeds and whispered the lessons it held. He understood now that the river remembered everything, the respect, the laughter, the arrogance, the loss, and that each person's actions were threads in a tapestry far larger than themselves. In silence he found peace. The priestess sometimes joined him, not to lead, not to correct, but to share the weight of remembrance. Together they acknowledged what had been lost and what had been gained. They understood that identity was fragile, that forgiveness was hard, and that reverence was not simply tradition, but recognition of life's delicate balance. The river carried these truths silently, endlessly, for any who would listen. At night, the river shimmered under the moon. It held the names, the stories, and the memories of those who had come before, of those who had faltered, and of those who had learned. The villagers slept with the comfort of knowing that even when they forgot, the water remembered. It held the past without judgment, the present without cruelty, and the future with the quiet assurance that life would continue in balance. And so the village endured. The river flowed. The man walked humbly. The priestess watched patiently. The stories lived on. And what the water remembered, names, deeds, laughter, and sorrow, would never truly vanish. It remained, a mirror of life itself, fragile, enduring, and sacred.